Okay, so this is part one of a video series that covers a very rudimentary workflow for motion capture cleanup in Autodesk Motion Builder. And in this video, I'm going to cover the user interface of Motion Builder. So when we first open up Motion Builder, this is what we're going to see. Some things look very similar and other things look quite different. But if we kind of break this down, it'll make a little bit more sense. So on the top left here, we have a shelf that is pretty standard across most software packages, which is where you have a file menu, an edit menu, and then you have some other menus here that are specialized to that software. So that's where you would go for that. Right below, we have the 3D viewport, which is where you're doing the bulk of your work. And by default, when I first opened up this software, the navigation controls were not set to Maya. But if you do want to change that, you can go to Settings, Interaction Mode, switch that to Maya here. So right below the 3D viewport, we have our playback controls. So here we have our timeline, where we can scrub through our timeline with this bar right here. Right above that, we have our animation takes. So this is where you can select different takes if you have them import into your scene. Then to the right of that, we have very standard playback controls, where you have play, stop, and then if you want to skip to the end or the beginning of your animation, you can do that as well. And then over here, we have some more custom features that you can play with if you want to change the frame rate and some other things here. So right below the playback controls, we have a couple of different shelves with some different panels here. I'll start over here with the navigator. So this panel right here works very similar to the outliner in Maya, which is where it stores a lot of things that are in your 3D scene. So right here I have a character, which I can just unhide and show you that real quick. So this is where you would store your characters. This is where you would store lights, materials, and some other things as well, constraints, sets, which I'll cover a little bit later. So this is where you would store a lot of things that will show up in your actual scene. To the right of that, we have the dope sheet. And to my understanding, which is a little limited, the dope sheet is a way of controlling your keys. The dope sheet allows you to go in and adjust the individual X, Y, and Z information of that animation. So you can change the timing of that here. Right next to the dope sheet, we have the F-curves panel. And the F-curves panel operates very similarly to the graph editor in Maya, which is where we have a graph here with our timeline set at the bottom, which we can scrub through. And then we have a very similar layout at the top here where you can control your curves, and you can also change your tangents here with some other things as well. So it's very similar to the graph editor. It just has kind of moved some things around. To the next of F-curves, we have the story panel. The story panel operates a little bit differently than we are used to in animation, where we deal with the graph editor and changing keys individually a lot. The story editor works a lot more like video editing, which is where you import a track of animation and you can cut and splice different tracks of animation together to create a clip. So that's where you do that here, and we'll cover that in a later video. And then to the right of story, we have the animation trigger panel, which I'm not going to go too into, but from my understanding, the animation trigger panel allows you to set up animations and then set up triggers for those animations. So that's kind of an overview of the navigator. To the right of that, we have a couple of different panels here. We have key controls and we have animation layers. These are things that are very useful when you're animating and will be used a lot when you're animating. So on key controls, just as it sounds, it just helps you control your keys and just, helps you in that workflow. It has a lot of tools that are very easily accessible right here. So you can scrub between your keys, you can key things, you can switch between animation triggers, and right below that panel we have the animation layers, which is very, very similar to what we are used to in Maya, working with animation layers. By default, Motion Builder will have your base animation layer, which is often where you will see your baked animation. And right above that, it'll set up a blank animation layer for you to work with. You're free to delete that or use it as you will. So next to that, we have the resources, which are basically a way of organizing and importing information into your scene. So over here to start, we have the pose controls panel, which is where if your character has a library of poses, or if you have a library of poses that you want to use, you can import those here and adjust those and use them accordingly. Next to that, we have properties, which is kind of helps you control your rigs and specific information. So if I select this arm joint here, you can go in change the translation, rotation information, and key that if you need to, just by pressing this K right there. So that's the properties panel. Next to that, we have filters, which, from my limited understanding, is a way to help you clean up motion capture keys. So it applies different filters to your animation to help clean up noise and some other things that you don't want if you're trying to polish animation. So to the right of filters, we have the asset browser, which is kind of where you import a lot of things. If I go down here to templates and I open that up, we'll see that we have a list of things here, which contain a variety of modifiers and basically scripts and sources of information that you would use in a project. So if I go in here to characters, we have some basic parameters set up that you can drag and drop into your scene. We have commands, so you can do some scripting. You have constraints, and then some other things here, physical properties with like a rigid body, if you did want to do some of that. So that's where that's stored. To the right of the asset browser, we have groups, which is another way of organizing your scene. So if you have a lot of different objects and things, you can organize that. And another way to do that is the sets panel right here, which is where if you have different sets that you're working with in one project, you can set up those with the sets panel and toggle between those as you're cleaning up or animating. So that's kind of an overview of these shelves down here. I'm going to hop up over to this character panel, which is where you're going to be working a lot with your characters. If you need to change different things like FK and IK or some different attributes, that's where you would do that. So you can select your character from here. You can select a source, which is if you have a character and you want them to inherit the animation from, let's say, a piece of motion capture data or a motion capture rig, you can select the source here. You have some different attributes up here, which you can change. This will toggle on and off the skeleton. I don't have this character set up as a control rig, but you can toggle on and off the skeleton, and you can change some different things here. One of the cool features that they have is that you can basically set up one of these tools. I think it's this one. It's this one, I think, where you can set up the IK, where you can pull the character along with the IK, and I'll show you that in a later video. So that's where we have that. We have the controls here, which is where you would see those controls, and then you also have definition, which is where you define your skeleton. So if you, like we brought this character into our scene, you can go in here and select these bones and set them to your character so it can read and create a control rig. So that's a very broad and basic overview of the user interface in Motion Builder. Okay, so this is part 2 of a video series going over very basic motion capture cleanup workflow in Autodesk Motion Builder. So in this video, I'm going to go over how to bring in characters into Autodesk Motion Builder. So we're going to bring in our motion capture information. We're also going to bring in another character and attach that motion capture information to that imported character. So what we need to do first is bring in a skeleton with baked animation. So what I've done is I've gone into Maya and I've just prepped a file. So I have this animation here with just some raw motion capture information, but I've gone in and I've cleaned it up. So originally I had 2 characters in here and a lot of unlabeled markers. I've just gone and deleted those and basically stripped it down to what I need, which is just this character right here. So one of the things I like to do is to zero out the rotation of all the joints at the first frame. And what I found is that this is really helpful when you bring this into Motion Builder and you need to define your skeleton. There's the system that it uses, it really needs perfectly zeroed out joints in order to correctly locate each joint and make sure it defines the control rig properly. So what I do is I just go into Maya real quick and I select all of these. So I just go in here and I go to Animation Editor's Graph Editor. Well, actually we'll do it this way. So I'll go select the hips and then select hierarchy. And then I'll just go into here. Let me just put this down so we can really zoom in here. And I'll basically just delete about 3 or 4 of the keyframes. And I'll just zero out the first one. So that way there's just a little bit of blend as it starts out. So that's what I like to do to basically prep this file. And once you've done that, you would just select either your hips, or you would select this locator here, and you would go up to File and then Export Selection, Export as FBX. So when you have that, we're going to go back into Motion Builder, and I'm going to locate the scene. So I'm going to locate the scene, and I'm just going to drag it and drop it in here. And right now, since we have nothing in this scene, it's a blank scene, it's just giving us this one option that says Open. But we really want to merge files whenever possible. So if you have that option down here to say Merge, click that, because Open basically creates a new scene. And Merge will merge whatever you're importing with the current scene, which is just a better way of working. You don't want to get rid of all of your work by importing something. So we're going to press FBX Open and Alt Takes, because we do have animation on this. So I'll click that. And then right here we have imported the skeleton. If I scrub through the timeline, we can see our motion capture information. So now we need to define a control rig. We need to define the skeleton of this motion capture information. And to do that, we're going to go over here to the asset browser and locate under templates characters. We're going to drag this, and we're just going to drop it into the scene. So it's going to create a character, and now we need to define the joints of this character so they can properly interpret the bones of this. So I kind of like to hop back and forth a little bit just so I know in my brain which joint I'm working with, but generally I'll start top to bottom. So in order to do this, we have this X right here. We need to get this green. In order to do that, we got to go in here and basically sift through each one of these joints and identify which one of these joints is properly located on this rig. So we're going to start off by just doing with the head. So I'm going to double tap on the head, and I'm just going to do a marquee selection. I like to do marquee selections because I find that just the single tap selection in Motion Builder isn't quite as responsive. So I just like to do that to be safe. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to open up the neck here. And I'm just going to click on, make sure this is, there we go. Sweet. We're going to go up one to the neck, 0, 1. And you can usually figure out which joint is which if you do need to find that information just by going through your scene. And you have the rig here, so you can go in and locate whatever joint you're working with. What I find with the clavicle is that you kind of need to move one over just a little bit in order to make it so that Motion Builder can identify which one is which. I've had issues in the past where if you leave it as is, it thinks that it's the same joint. So you got to go in, and I usually just scoot that over just a little bit. So open up this guy. I'm going to do that, and if your joints are properly zeroed out, it should start mirroring everything. So if I just double click on this arm, you'll start seeing that it's going over to the left side as well. So we're just going to select the hand, and we don't have any fingers, so we're not going to do that. And now I like to start from the hip and work up, just because I just like to hit these base points first. So then we're going to hit the spine. That, open up the spine, and do these other joints here. And we'll finally get this one here. Cool, so now we do the legs. So I'm going to go down here, double tap on the right legs. Just get these properly defined. Oops. There we go. And from what I've heard, I've watched a lot of tutorials, and I've heard a couple of people say that in order to get the best toe bend, if you only have one joint here, just select the big toe, that root joint, just right there. And you should get some pretty decent toe bend, even if you don't have toes. So now you can see we've defined our character. We get this nice big green check mark here, which is good. It means that everything's in place and our character should be defined. So in order to create a character, I'm going to go and I'm going to lock this. And it's going to ask character, do you want us to do a biped, quadruped, or cancel? And we're going to do biped. So just like that. So we have this character created. Now, what we need to do is bring in another character in order to sync up this motion capture information with that character. So I'm going to go and I'm going to locate my other character with no animation on it. Cool, so I've located my character with no animation. I'm just going to drag and drop this in here. And now you see we have this merge option. So we're going to go merge, and we're going to press no animation because there is no animation on this. So now we have this character in, and what we want to do is we actually do have joints on this character as well. So if I go in here, I'm just going to hide Josh, this rig for now. So I'm going to go into properties, and I'm going to uncheck visibility. So just so we can focus on this guy. And I'm also going to hide this geometry here as well. So I'm going to uncheck visibility. So we can see we have joints here. And if I just pull up Josh again, this rig, you'll notice that the joints, there's a different number of joints between both these characters. The benefit of working in Motion Builder is that there's a little bit of give when it comes to defining your skeleton. So if you correctly define your skeleton, and Motion Builder is able to figure out the general proportions of your character and the bones, this is not a problem. This will be able to transfer between these two, so which is really cool. So I'm going to select Josh again, and I'm going to unhide, or I'm going to hide Josh. And now we're going to define the bones of this character. So again, we're going to go into the asset browser. We're going to drag character, drag it in here, and now we're going to define this character. So same process, and I'm just going to do this real quick. All right, so this character is correctly defined, and we're just going to create another biped as well. So now we have two characters, and in order to see kind of what's going on here, if you go into your navigator, you navigate down to characters, open this up, you'll see we have character and character 1. And so this is basically where we're seeing these characters here. So I'm going to unhide these real quick. So I'm going to click on Josh and unhide him. And we know that Josh's character, just character, because it was the first one that we brought in, character 1 being the second character we made. So I'm just going here, I'm going to right click and I'm going to rename. I'm going to say Josh. I'm also going to click on character 1. I'm going to say, I'll just say Rig Geo. So now what we need to do is attach the animation from this rig over to Josh. So I'm going to unhide this geometry here. And if I click on, we're going to click on Rig Geo. Okay. And if I select source and I press Josh, you'll see that this character will hop over into the position that Josh was. Now, if I scrub through this on the timeline, you'll see that this motion capture information is now transferring over to our Rig Geo, which is super cool. So if I just play this, we will see that we have the first step into bringing in motion capture information, cleaning it up. So we brought it in, and in the next video, we're going to go over some constraints. So this character is going to grab a ping pong paddle. We're going to make that happen in the next video. Okay, so this is part 3 of a video series going over really basic motion capture cleanup in Autodesk Motion Builder. So in this video, I'm going to get into data cleanup as well as some constraints. So at the end of last video, we basically figured out how to import skeletons and also import characters. And we also figured out how to take motion capture information that is baked onto a skeleton and transfer that to a character. So if we just kind of scrub through this here, oops, let me set this to Josh. So we can reference another rig to inherit animation, which is really powerful. But in order to really clean this up and have a little bit more control over the data when we go in and we fix it, there's one more step that we want to do. So as of right now, this rig, this character here, our Rig Geo, actually doesn't have any animation baked onto it. It's just referencing another character and taking that animation and displaying it. So what we want to do is we want to basically bake animation onto this rig so that we have a little bit more control. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just double click here onto this Rig Geo, and we're going to go to the character settings, and we're going to press input type to character. We're going to make sure active is checked, and under input source we're going to say Josh, because Josh is the character with is the skeleton with animation on it. So that's the animation that we want to inherit for this character. So we have that there. I'm going to press plot character, and I'm going to click control rig. We're going to create a control rig for this character, and I want an FKIK. So it's going to pull up this panel here with some options. And for the most part, these can be left unchecked or unchanged. We don't really need to change anything here, except for this right here, this constant key reducer. We want to leave that unchecked. And the reason why is that the constant key reducer, from what I understand, is a way of reducing your key count, where it'll go into your animation and it'll delete certain keys that Motion Builder deems is unnecessary, and it'll replace that with interpolated curves. In this case, we don't actually want that. We want to keep all of that information so that we have more control and we have more data to work with when we do our cleanup. So we're going to leave that unchecked, and I'm going to press plot. It's going to do a little bit of work. And now if I go into this geometry and I just hide it, you see we have a control rig here, and if I play this back on the timeline, you'll see that this control rig now has animation. And it is now the driving force of our rig geo. So now we can go in and we can start doing some data cleanup. So I'm going to just unhide these, and we're going to look for just a couple problem areas that we may want to fix. So we're going to go in and we're going to do a little bit of cleanup on this character here. I've noticed that the toes are not posed correctly. These toes are not posed as they should be. They should be flat along with the heel and the floor. So we're going to go in and we're going to fix that. So under the F-Curves tab, the panel, we're going to click on our animation layer 1, and we're going to make sure that it is not muted. And we're going to go in here, and I'm going to just click on this guy. Make sure that these are selected, otherwise you won't be able to see your keys. So we're going to make sure that these are selected here. And I'm going to just rotate this up until it should be okay. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to press key. Perfect. Go on to the other side. Oops. That's not what we want. What's going on here? There we go. And that looks good, so we're going to press key again. Oops. Make sure these are selected. Key. Okay, so now if we play this back, we have fixed our toes. Perfect. So we have part of that fixed. And I noticed as well that the arm here had some intersections. Right there. Okay, so we're going to fix this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go, so we have our problem area right here. I'm going to backtrack to before when it starts intersecting. Just right there. That sounds good. Okay. So I'm going to select this IK handle right here. Make sure that that's selected. Perfect. Select these guys. And we're just going to key it straight off the bat. So I'm going to locate this in my timeline. I'm going to key it. Now I'm going to scrub through to where we have probably the most intersecting going on. I'm just going to take this, I'm going to scoot this over just so that we can get rid of some of that intersecting. That looks okay, maybe a little bit more. Okay. And I'm also going to key this as well. So if we scrub this back now, we have fixed that part of the data. So I've gone in and I've cleaned up most of the motion capture data. You'll probably notice that the hands are still really stiff, and I've been waiting to do that because I do want to add a prop. This character is going to be grabbing a ping pong paddle right about here. So we're going to go in and we're going to add some constraints to this character so that he can pick up this prop. We're going to do that in Motion Builder. So the first step in setting this up is to import your geometry. So in this case, this character is going to be grabbing a ping pong paddle. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab that. So I have the paddle here. I'm just going to click, drag, and we're going to merge, no animation. Okay. So that's going to go into the scene. This is a pretty small object, so I'm going to scale it up. What we're going to do here is I'm just going to go in and position this to where the character is going to grab it, just so that we have a frame of reference when we set up this constraint. Okay, so this paddle is positioned more or less in the right place, and we can always fix this later. But now we're going to get some constraints going on this. So in order to start activating some constraints, we're going to go over here to the Asset panel, the Asset Browser panel. And under Templates, if you go down here, there's a Constraints tab. So we'll click on that, and we're going to be using this parent-child constraint. So I'm going to grab this and this, just drag it into the scene. So it's going to give us two options here. We're going to attach a child, and we're going to attach a parent. The child is going to be the paddle, and the parent is going to be this wrist control right here. So in order to plug these in, I found that it's best to just go in here, and here's the ping pong paddle. I'm going to rename it. It's best to go in here and just drag it from the navigator. So I'm going to go in here, drag that under child, and I'm going to select this control, open this up, drag this under parent. Okay. So we've set that up, and if we play this back, we'll notice that the character and the paddle aren't attached yet. And the reason why is because we need to click one option here. Let me just set this back to about right here. We're going to click snap. So as soon as we click that, it should snap right into place. Perfect. So it's kind of floating in his hand, so we do need to fix that pose. But the first thing we need to do before that is we need to keyframe this constraint, because as of right now, he shouldn't be holding this paddle until he reaches out and snatches it. So we're going to go back to this frame right here. Let's see, go over one more frame. Okay, we'll do that. And I'm going to key the weight right here. We're going to press this K right there. Okay, I'm going to go back one frame. I'm going to set this to 0. And we're going to key it again. So now when we play it, this character will snatch that ping pong paddle. Sweet. So we have that set up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pose the hands. So we're going to go back in, and we're going to polish up this mocap with just getting that hand pose right there. So, okay, so I've just kind of skipped ahead, and I just went through and I cleaned up all of the motion capture data, repeating the same process. And I just, skipped the process of having to make you watch all the way through it. So I just went through and added the ping pong ball, and also just cleaned up the animation a little bit, added the, the hit and everything. But I essentially followed the same process. But let me talk about some things here that I kind of learned during this, which were really important, I think, for if you're working with animation or anything in here. The first is I was using F-curves for a while, and it's not, from what I found, it's not the primary place to work. You can see a lot of the keys that are happening in there, but it shouldn't be where you keyframe things. So you can see a lot of this going on. You can see your curves in here, but you really want to keyframe things in here, right? This timeline bar right here. Because let's say I were to copy and paste these keyframes right here, okay? We have, or actually better yet, this one, right? Because if we scrub through here, you'll see that that wrist really changes its position. So I'm going to copy these keyframes, and I'm scrub through here. And if I paste these in here, you notice that the wrist doesn't move, even though the curves do. And the reason why is because we're not working in here, okay? If I were to undo this, okay, I'm going to go through here, and I'm going to click on this keyframe. I'm going to copy that, and back right here, okay? And I made a mistake here. What you want to do is you want to do a marquee, okay? So you want to click that, copy, and we'll paste. And now you see that it makes the proper change. So when you're working in the when you're working with animation, you're working with keys, you want to be keying in here. Some of the other things I noticed were depending on, and I've read a little bit up on this when I had this problem, but my controls started disappearing, and apparently it's a bug that is somewhat recurrent in Motion Builder. But if that ever happens, I found that if anything happens in here and you can't get it back, you can always go in here and select things from here, right? So if I needed to select this and this control wasn't here, I could go in and just tap right here and it'll select it for me. So that's one of the things that was really handy. Same with working with the fingers. Sometimes, like when we were working and I was getting this paddle grab, it was a lot easier to just go in here and select that pointer finger than to try to, get around here, maybe frame up and then do that. Just a lot easier to select it in here. Same thing over here. There's some of the things that you can do that were pretty handy is if you shift click, you'll select all of the fingers, and then you can just key them really easily if you needed to there. So that was another thing. And then I also found out here is that you have a couple different modes when you're working with keying up here. You have this right here, which is body part. You have here, which is no pole manip. And you have this right here, which was full body. So this is important when you're working with keying, because when you have full body checked and you key anything, it's going to key every control on your control rig. And sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. But it's good to keep in mind if that's checked or not. If you're just working with, let's say, these fingers, right, you may not want to check full body because you don't necessarily need all those keyframes getting cluttered up into your whole control rig. So this right here is a pretty handy option if you need to have a little bit more control over your IK handles. So if I have full body checked, and I grab this IK wrist, and I pull it over, you'll see that the whole character comes along with it. And if we don't want that to happen, you can select no pole manip right here. If I check that and I try doing it again, we'll see that the character does not come past that point right there, that stretching point for the character. So So that can be pretty handy if you're trying to really like get a pose and you can't get the character to move without the rest of his body moving. Might be good to check no pull in the nip. So that was pretty handy. And overall, I've also found that working with these animation layers is really, really useful. So if you've done a bunch of work on one animation layer and then you need to go back and fix something that might interfere with this one, you can just go and add another one and work with that. I've also found that this is really handy. If you need to key an animation layer, you can. There's a weight option right here with a K, with a keyframe option, so you can actually key those as well. So that was most of the workflow for animation cleanup. And constraints as well were pretty simple, just going through and making sure that, we go over here to the navigator, making sure that, let's see, constraints. Just making sure that these are set up properly with your child and parent, active, snapping, keying the weight and everything that you need to. So yeah, overall quite simple, pretty similar to Maya. And I think that working with the control rig is actually really, really useful because it gives you the option of working between FK and IK. So if you ever did need to switch, you can just make the switch real quick, do that animation, key it, and then go back to IK if you need to. So I found that was a really useful way to work and a good workflow. And so that's about it for this video, which was going over motion capture cleanup as well as going over constraints. So we finished up our motion capture, and we've also added the necessary constraints that we need. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about merging animation, how you can take two clips of different animation and combine those into one. Okay, so this is part 4 of motion capture cleanup workflow for Autodesk Motion Builder. And in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about merging animation clips and how you can take two different clips of animation and combine them into one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to the Previous Moves folder right here, which is just kind of a library of different animations that we can attach to our character. So I'm going to find Run Straight, and I'm just going to drag this one in here. And then I'm also going to find Run Upstairs. We're going to put that one here too. In order to activate the story panel, you need to check this right here where it says Story. Just click that, make sure it's highlighted. And then you will have your animation show up down here. And it'll attach to the rig. One thing to keep in mind is that working between the story panel and your F-curves panel, it's a little tricky. So from what I understand, until you get your clips ready and you bake them, you don't really hop back into the F-curves panel, or you don't mess around with keys or anything until you get these clips more or less figured out. So what we want to do is we want to blend these two clips together. And if I play this back, you'll see that we have this character running, and then we have a character running upstairs. There's a couple different problems here. The first is that they're in different positions. So we're going to need to figure that out. We also need to blend between these two animations. So we can do that by just starting to go in here and clip some of these things. So what's helped me kind of understand the story editor is treating it a lot like video editing, where you see this more as a video clip than keyframes, so on and so forth. So this is like baked animation, but it's seen as like a clip of video. That's kind of helped me understand it a little bit more. So let's start blending these two clips together. So from what I've found, it's good to kind of find similar poses that you can start transitioning in between. And in this case, I'm going to start with this character putting her right foot forward. So I'll start about right here. I'm going to drag this back, and then I'm going to bring this clip over. We're going to see where that starts. And we can see that that character's right foot is coming down. So it'll be good to kind of transition between these two clips if we have the right foot kind of connecting the movement. So if you can kind of get an idea of it, you can see the right foot coming up and coming down. Maybe we'll push this over a little bit more. Tad more. So it comes a little bit more in front. Let's see. See about that. So that's looking pretty good. So we get that right foot kind of blending a little bit, even though it's not in the same position quite yet. So now what we're going to do is I'm just going to drag this clip and I'm start pulling it over. Do you see this kind of cross going on? It's a transition between these two. So if I scrub through this, you'll see that it's transitioning between the two, but it's also taking the positions as well. if we look at that right foot, it's pretty good. I'd say the transition is pretty alright. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to merge the position of these two clips together so that we can get a more fluid animation. So I'm going to go to the right to the middle of these two clips, right in the middle of that cross, of that X. And I'm going to go up here and I'm going to click on Match. So our match options are going to open up. And since we have this clip selected, we're going to say Match to Next Clip. We're going to say Match at Current Time because we're at the time that we want to match at. And then we also want to check XYZ and XYZ for translation and rotation. So we're going to hit OK. And now if we scrub through this, we do get a decent transition between these two clips. So if I play this back now, you'll see that now it's a much smoother transition. And one thing that you can do if you really want to go in and polish this is you can select, let's say, the root control, and you can click on this up here. So make sure that this is checked. And what that's going to do is if I just zoom out and I check this, you'll see that it starts a trail. It basically shows you where this control is in space. So if we scrub back through the timeline, you'll see that it gives you a nice ghosting there so that you can see exactly what's going on with the curves if you do need to go back and edit them. So at this point, we finished our transition between these two clips, and now we want to essentially go back and we want to bake this into the keyframes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select these two clips, so this one and this one. I'm going to right click, and we're going to say Plot Whole Scene to Current Take. Okay, we're going to make sure Plot on Frame, I don't know if that's okay. 24 frames, make sure constant key is unchecked, and then we'll say Plot. So it's going to do that real quick. And now you see we have a bunch of keyframes that show up on our timeline. So if I hop back over into the F-curves, and let's say I select translation, you'll see that now we have plotted all of that information onto actual keyframes. So if we go back into here and let's say unchecked story, you'll see that nothing happens. The animation doesn't disappear. That's because we have plotted it into our actual timeline. So if you wanted to, you could go in here and you can say you can select some of these and you can start adjusting these accordingly. So if you needed to flatten these out, or let's say this one right here, you want to move these up or down, push these in, push these out, you can do that now. So you have a lot more control once you figured out roughly where your take is, going in, plotting it, and then adjusting the keyframes, so on and so forth. And of course, the same things apply that we discussed in previous videos, where you can add an animation layer, and you can start animating on top of that. And you can key those as well. You can. We're working with the control rig here, so there's a lot we can do. We can set up more constraints if we wanted to. And so Motion Builder is very layer based, where you can go in and really change a lot in and out if you needed to. So that's kind of a really broad overview of the story panel. But yeah, merging animations is something that would be very useful if you have a lot of. I see a lot of use for it in games. I think probably where you have a lot of different animations you need to combine. That seems like a very good place to do that. So that was a very broad overview of merging animation clips together. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about exporting and saving files in Motion Builder. Okay, so this is part 5 of motion capture cleanup workflow in Autodesk Motion Builder. And in this video, I'm going to talk about saving and exporting files in Motion Builder. So we've worked on this animation for a little bit, and now we want to save this file. So there's a couple different ways to save files in Motion Builder. You can go up here to Save As, and it's going to ask you some different things. If you want to save it as a FBX binary or an FBX ASCII, you can do that. You can also save per take. So if you have multiple takes in your scene, you can go down here and save one per take file, because it'll save them out separately so that you can import each take again if you would need to, or if you do want to just separate them and have them be different files altogether, you can do that. So the advantage of saving as FBX in Motion Builder is that things are very transferable. You can move things around very quickly because FBX files are very common in different softwares. And in the last video, I went over how to combine two clips together. And I use this folder right here with just this library of different animations. Well, these animations here are just FBX files, much like Mixamo, which just stores animation FBX. So you can bring those in, and it has the skeleton, which you can quickly define up in here. So you could just drag that FBX file in here and then very, very quickly attach your character. So if you ever wanted to store your own animation, you could just export the skeleton here and then re-import it over here. So you can store that animation in Motion Builder if you did want to use it at some other point. So the primary way of exporting anything out in Motion Builder is to export out in FBX. And in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to bake this control rig onto the skeleton. So I'm going to go here, I'm just going to select the hip, I'm going to go to this blue box, I'm going to do bake plot, and I'm going to bake it to skeleton. I'm going to wait a second, and the control rig is going to disappear. And now we have that animation baked onto the skeleton of our character. And so now it's ready to export. So what we're going to do is I'm going up here to File, and we're going to Export Motion File. And you could just title this whatever you would like. I'll just do just like that, and I'll hit Save. So it's going to give us some options here. And since we only have one take, we don't really need to worry about this. But let's say you have multiple takes in your scene. You could go in and you could uncheck the ones you don't want, or you could check the ones that you do want. Another option you have is to go over here to the left side where it has one take per file. So if you wanted to separate out these takes in individual FBX files, you would just check that box and you could separate out the takes in order to use them separately or individually. So in this case, this is fine. So I'm just going to hit Export, and it's going to export our animation. Another way of exporting this file is to export it directly into a Maya scene. So what you can do is you can go up here to the top left, press File, and you have a Send to Maya option box. So what you can do here is you can send as new scene, or you can update a current scene. So if you have Maya open, like I do, you could just update current scene, or you can send as new scene and it'll open up Maya for you. So in this case, I'm just going to press Update Current Scene, and selection is empty, send the whole scene. We're going to say OK. So we're going to let it do that, and it's going to open up Maya, and it's going to import our files. So once we have that, we can just play it back, and we see that we have our updated animation imported into Maya. So that was a very broad overview of motion capture cleanup in Autodesk Motion Builder. Thanks for watching.